So the title of the session is How to Combat Fake News, and when we've found the answers to that, I'll be very interested to find out what they are. I'll now introduce Mark Wood, Chairman of Nominet, who's also chairing this panel session.
Good afternoon, thank you. Thanks. So we're waiting for Chi to arrive and leave this chair free for her, and we'll involve her as soon as she gets here, but we want to kick off. We have a terrific panel here to discuss this subject, a subject which a lot of people feel strongly about. I'm going to get them now, first of all, to introduce themselves, and then I'll say a few things and start asking a few questions, but then I want to open the floor up so that we get Q's and A's from all of you. So can I just ask you to introduce yourselves, starting with Simon at the end.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Simon Milner. I'm a policy director for Facebook, based in the UK, but covering a large part of Europe, Middle East and Africa.
Good afternoon, I'm James Cook. I'm Business Insider UK technology editor in the UK. We're also expanding across Europe at the moment. We do startups, enterprise, big tech company coverage, which is why I'm here.
Hi everyone, I hope you're all awake after lunch. I'm Carl Miller, I'm the Research Director at the Centre for the Analysis of Social Media at the UK think tank Demos.
Thank you very much. Now, this morning is interesting. We had a discussion around keeping the internet safe, particularly around cybersecurity, and of course this is the issue around keeping the internet safe in terms of information and what people are seeing and how they're being informed. Fake news, I'll come on to what is fake news. Fake news is not a new phenomenon, as we know. I mean, it's got quite a lot of historical precedents. There's a brilliant play on in the West End at the moment, Queen Anne, and when Queen Anne came to the throne because James II was overthrown in the Glorious Revolution on the back of news sheets spreading the news that his son was not legitimate, but had been smuggled into the bedchamber in a warming pan. That actually unleashed a revolution. It was real, pure fake news. There was not a shred of truth in it, but it was to undermine the king. We had, the Second World War was started by effectively fake news when the Germans claimed that in fact an attack carried out by their own people on a German radio station being carried out by the Poles. So fake news is not new. What is new is the scale. And it's taken on a different scale in all directions. Some of it's frivolous and fairly entertaining and harmless. I saw a few days ago, there was a brilliant, a couple of weeks ago, picture of a shark swimming up a street in Houston during the floods, which apparently the same shark has appeared in New Orleans and various other floods all around the world. And there you go. And that goes viral very quickly. Pretty harmless stuff. Looking through incidents of fake news, I saw that the most viral fake news story on Facebook last year was, I think it was police arrest woman for defecating on her boss's desk after she won the lottery. And that was spread around nearly 2 million times and completely untrue. But does it matter? In the great scheme of things, not really. What does matter is when it becomes serious fake news, if you like, and it becomes political and affects the way people think and the way they vote. I saw one analysis that in the US election, the share of fake news amongst articles read on the election by Americans exceeded the number, on Facebook this is, the number of genuine news stories read by Americans. And I'll come back to Simon on that one. And this week in the Financial Times, Gideon Rachman, a very good commentator, argued that Russian hacking and fake news distribution had swung the American election for Trump. So that's a pretty serious impact. So it does have a serious effect. There are things happening to combat it. But let me kick off by asking the panel here, what do they see as fake news? It's a broad definition. How do they view it? How do they view the threat of it? And let me start with you.
All right, well, everybody, firstly, very good afternoon. Wonderful to be here. So I know it is so kind of irksome when a researcher dwells on semantics and definitions at the beginning of a debate. I know how boring and difficult that is to hear, and that's exactly what I'm going to do to begin this one. Fake news is an unbelievably unhelpful concept for us to try and work out what exactly is happening online at the moment, and I'll tell you why. It conflates two utterly different phenomena with each other. On the one hand, fake news is used to describe deliberate, concerted misinformation attempts, often state-based, understood as influence operations, media operations, psychological warfare. So problem number one is that the internet has become militarized, social media has become militarized. Literally, these are now regarded by militaries around the world as theatres of war. And militaries around the world have developed capabilities in order to fight and try to win on those theatres. So that's problem number one. The other thing that fake news is used to describe is the clickbait economy. So this is people that draft stories, whether true or false, they don't care, in order to harvest clicks, harvest all of our eyeballs in order to make money primarily from advertising. I met a fake news merchant in Kosovo quite recently. He's called Drilon. He's 26. He came, it was difficult to meet. He didn't really want to talk about it for the reason that he was making loads of money doing this. So he had a big Rolex watch, he had some nice shades, he bought me loads of coffee, and he described to me kind of how this, you know, it was like going through the Facebook groups. It was like wandering with a proud vineyard owner through his estates, kind of showing me all the views and all the things that he'd built. Utterly different. Basically apolitical, didn't care about politics at all. Most of us don't care about politics at all. It's not the kind of things we actually click on. The stories that really he was sharing, and it was all driven by what other people were clicking on, were gore stories. So the story that day that Drilon was making all the money that he was using to buy me coffee was a story about a woman in Walmart that had knocked the teeth of her like 6-year-old son out in the toilet in Walmart for some reason, using a screwdriver she'd bought in Walmart. Gory story, probably untrue as far as I can tell, and getting absolutely loads of clicks. So that's my kind of like point I like to kick this debate off. Two completely different things, misinformation and clickbait, different phenomena, different drivers, different solutions.
Thank you. James, Business Insider.
So I think in addition to what I think a lot of people assume that fake news is written by sort of guys sitting at home in their bedrooms wanting to rack up ad spend on their websites, or hackers in North Korea or Russia. But I think another issue, and I guess this is time where perhaps I should hold my hands up and accept some responsibility, is the media and the establishment media as a whole, in a sort of race to the bottom of online content in search of ad clicks, standard slip and verification slips. You know, you see newspapers laying off fact checkers, sub-editors, things like that. And I think a poorly edited false news story from a major publication, of which there are many, is also a large issue with fake news. So I don't want to sort of blame these sort of bloggers all the time. I think there are times when us as journalists need to stand up and raise our standards and be more conscious of fake news. You know, I think it was The Independent has a fake news team where they're debunking news online, whereas they also publish things that are misleading, as do many other publications. I think we all have our role to play in that, including us as journalists.
Thanks very much, Mark. Pleasure to be here. Some of you may have seen earlier this year that I got interviewed on Panorama about this issue. It was a bit like kind of Paxman on Michael Howard, in that the journalist kept asking me the same question, and the question he was asking is, how much fake news is there on Facebook and how much money do you make from it? Some of you may even remember what I said, which was, several times, we believe the amount is very small and we make a negligible amount of money from it. The questions kept coming, all asked in pretty much the same way each time, and I kept giving the same answer. What he never asked me is, does it matter? Does it matter to Facebook that there is any fake news on our platform? And you might have thought I would have said no, given that I was saying it was a very small amount, the amount of money we were making from it was negligible. In fact, I would have said yes. It really matters. And that's because of the volume and scale of our platform and the impact that false news can have. We have a community of more than 2 billion people regularly using Facebook. So very small can still mean that several 100,000 people are having a bad experience on Facebook. And for some of them, it could mean they end up believing something which is untrue and that they act upon it. It can have a disproportionate impact on the decisions that people might make. It can also lead to governments restricting access to the internet, which I know is of huge importance to this audience and indeed the IGF community around the world. So governments using the excuse of false news during elections to restrict access to platforms for speech. It can waste people's time, it certainly can waste advertising spend associated with poor content, and it's bad for the media and democratic ecosystem. So irrespective of both in terms of the two types of fake news that Carl rightly identified, and indeed there are others, there is an absolute need for us to work with publishers like Business Insider and other publishing organizations and academics and this community to try and see what we can do to tackle this problem.
Do you accept the Gideon Rachman charge that Facebook played a major part in influencing the outcome of the American election by carrying so much fake news?
Look, I think anyone who wants to say that there is a single reason why there was a particular outcome in the US presidential election is searching for something which isn't there. As with all elections, including recent surprising election results in this country over the last couple of years, there are a host of different reasons for it, some of which may include the way in which the campaigns and others use platforms like Facebook. We wouldn't be seeking to address this issue. We wouldn't have made the announcement we did last week about these Russian accounts that we have found and taken down off Facebook if we weren't trying to help the authorities in the US get to the heart of what was going on around that election. And if there is something that was happening on Facebook, and it certainly seems there were attempts to try and use our platform, let's try and surface these, let's be transparent about them, and let's help the authorities as they write their reports on this figure out what was going on.
Okay. Well, let's stay on that issue of what should social media platforms be doing, what can they do, and what are they doing now? So, Carl, what's your thinking about what they ought to be doing as opposed to what they are doing?
That question is asked so often. I think there's a huge amount of pressure.
Oh, sorry.
Hello.
Yeah.
There's a huge amount of pressure being put on Facebook and the other tech giants. I think the tech giants are having to walk this very careful line at the moment. And we've never had companies like Google and Facebook before. We've never had companies that have become so important to our public debate being in the positions that they are. And I'm kind of worried by the amount of responsibility and pressure that we put on the tech giants to try and fix this for us. Because often those fixes have to be global. Often those fixes are coming from those companies themselves. And I think it's very difficult for Facebook or anyone to develop fixes to things like fake news in ways that everyone will be happy with. I mean, we at Demos, one thing we've long argued is that digital literacy has to be part of the national curriculum. I mean, we've seriously got to start changing the kind of skills that we teach people. I mean, I think often in this case, and in so many, the gatekeepers have been washed away. You know, the kind of professional journalists, the anthologists, the people that used to make decisions on our behalf about what information could or couldn't enter the public sphere. Professional journalists, to a large degree, don't make those decisions for us anymore. Anything can enter the public sphere, and it's always going to be entering the public sphere. We'll never be able to get rid of fake news from online spaces, however the clever algorithms are that are created. And that means we've all got to teach ourselves to be our own gatekeepers. We've all got to be able to teach ourselves to sort fact from fiction online. I think that's the only long-term sustainable and strategic solution to this. So I actually would prefer us to be looking to entities other than Facebook for what they can do in terms of fixing this, and especially I think educators and legislators.
Okay. Gee, I'll bring you straight in. I'm going to come back round to regulation in a second, but we're talking now about we've talked about what is fake news, and now saying what about the social media platforms? What should they be doing? What could they do?
Well, I think I agree with you, and I don't agree with you. Yeah. I'm sorry I'm late. There was an accident, and on Regent Street, and I can get here. But so I think my background, I was a member of Parliament for Newcastle Central and the Shadow Minister for Industrial Strategy, Science and Innovation. So I have that interest in this. But I'm also a chartered electrical engineer, and I spent 20 years building out networks into the internet before I came into Parliament, as well as working for Ofcom, the regulator, as head of technology. And so I'd say that fake news has numerous definitions, and getting into a debate about it it doesn't necessarily pay off. I think we need to look at what are the, if you like, the bad consequences for public good. You know, as a legislator, that's what I need to look at from some of the, I think, and that's why I agree with you about the lack or the death, if you like, of authenticated news and the democratization of news generation. And then we need to look at what are the skills and the rights that we need to give our citizens, my constituents, to be able to address that. And I think, you know, I'm not sure, so I think the social media giants can do a lot more. So I think you're absolutely right to say it shouldn't be left to them, because that is why we have, you know, it's why we develop democracy and government, because we don't think that necessarily individual actors should be able to act on the basis of their power rather than on the basis of the interests of citizens. But I do think social media giants can do a lot more. They have, I'm a tech evangelist. Tech can do fantastic and amazing things. And if you can decide what you're going to advertise to me based on somewhere I visited 5 months ago, you know, for 5 minutes, you can figure out some of what is authentic or not authentic news. And also, but equally importantly, the algorithms which decide what news I am fed are total black boxes. And that, you know, it's a generation of news, but it's the circulation that actually causes most of the harm. It's the circulation without provenance. And so that is driven by algorithms, which the tech giants refuse to give transparency to on the basis that they're commercially sensitive, but at the same time, aren't taking responsibility for some of the consequences of that. I think that needs to be looked at, and I think I agree absolutely about education, critical things, putting power into people's hands to decide between all these different news sources, which is the ones that they trust. I agree absolutely with that, but I do think there's a role for government and for the tech giants as well.
Thank you. James, do you want to follow up on that?
Sure. I must admit, I didn't expect to agree with Shadow Minister coming to this debate, but I'm pleasantly surprised that we do. And I think there is a danger that we sort of absolve Facebook and other social media companies of responsibility of moderating fake news and fixing this problem, and that a lot of the messaging that comes out of them is putting the onus onto the user to sort of police their own networks. And my concern with that message, with saying, you report things, you let us know what is fake, you flag URLs to us, is that if users don't know how to do that, or don't care, or don't have time, that moderation doesn't happen. And if Facebook isn't proactive enough, or it doesn't develop technological solutions, fake news continues to spread. There was a good report in, I believe, BuzzFeed recently about private communities on Facebook, which aren't public, where parents discuss so-called cures for autism, which includes things like bleach enemas, which they believe cures autism. Completely harmful, incredibly dangerous, and these things spread on Facebook in private. People aren't moderating these discussions because many people there believe the same thing. It's not in the public view. It doesn't have that sort of public sort of discourse. And that's my concern, is that if we put the onus onto the user and say it's your job to an extent to police fake news, there's a danger that just won't happen.
Thanks. Interesting. Simon, what, as one of the social media platforms,
giants be doing more?
Yes. What are you doing, and could you do more?
Sure. We're doing things under 4 headings at the moment on this topic. So we are collaborating with others to try to find industry solutions to this problem, and that includes things like our Facebook journalism project to try and help publishers and journalists to be able to make better use of the tools that our platforms provide, and that's including Facebook and Instagram, to reach consumers with their and readers with their stories. We're disrupting economic incentives. As Carl mentioned earlier, a lot of fake news that you might see is really clickbait. It's actually designed to take you off of a platform like Facebook onto a website full of ads where you're going to have a pretty bad experience, but nonetheless they will still make some money out of poor quality advertising. And so we want to try and, what we're doing is finding ways to disrupt those economic incentives. So attacking the fake accounts which are often associated with this kind of clickbaity content. We announced during the French election that we'd taken down 30,000 accounts that we'd found were associated with this ahead of the election campaign in order to try to address that, and we had similar kind of success in terms of the UK. We're trying to build new products to curb the spread of false news and to improve information diversity. So things like a product called Perspectives. So in fact, a product we used that was launched during the UK election, which is when somebody clicked on a link that was shared by one of their friends about the election or about an issue discussed during the election, we would surface to them a kind of election portal where they could go to find out about where all the different parties stood on a range of issues. So again, providing different perspectives for people. And then you're right, we absolutely also want to help people make informed decisions when they encounter false news. And we've done that in the UK and elsewhere with both newspaper adverts, old style, and information on Facebook of kind of 10 top tips for spotting false news. Not ones we've created, but created by our partners at Full Fact and First Draft. But I just want to, we're also trying to be more transparent about how this all works. So to Chi's kind of question about kind of algorithmic transparency, and we think putting out all the code onto how Facebook works wouldn't necessarily help people. I'm sure it would be absolutely fascinating for hackers who would love to be able to get their hands on Facebook's code in order to try to subvert the way that Facebook works. But what we are doing is being much more transparent about when we make changes to newsfeed and explaining why we're doing it, what we're trying to do, and the purpose behind it. And we've also recently introduced a hard questions blog where we write about some of the kind of really the toughest issues we deal with, including hate speech, including terrorism, and what we are trying to do, working in partnership to try and address those issues. So we are trying to be more transparent. That may not, as I say, it's not the full algorithm, but we think it's absolutely helping people. We have evidence it's helping people understand what Facebook's doing in this space.
Carl, you want to go back on that?
Yeah, I think there's often a kind of temptation to reach for technical solutions to technical problems. Now, the kind of clickbait side of fake news is in my eyes as much as of a social problem as anything else. Let me just briefly go back to Drillon, our fake news merchant. He employed 8 people. Those 8 people all worked in a kind of office in kind of downtown Pristina, kind of finding content and putting it on. Drillon made about €1,000 a day. In Kosovo, that is a fortune. That is far more than he could have earned through any of the government curated and supported digital programs, of which there were some washing around. So for Drillon, it was an entirely rational kind of decision for himself in terms of what an ambitious, young, energetic and entrepreneurial, computer-savvy 26-year-old Kosovan was going to do with himself to begin to build a fake news empire. Drillon told me that there's about 3,000 people that he knows around the Balkans who are somehow involved in this. There's a whole black economy. They buy and sell Facebook sites from each other. Verified Facebook pages are more valuable. Sometimes they use Facebook advertising to actually build up the site. Sometimes they buy sites which have been legitimate and turn them into clickbait farms. Now, I would take the salary of one Facebook machine learning expert in Silicon Valley and set up a digital entrepreneur center in the Balkans. And I genuinely think that a lot of the actual generation of this content would begin to go away if you actually give these people different options, more constructive options for what they can actually do with their time there. Now, I think the technical, but the other side of this, and I think we don't speak much about this, but this is what I'm actually especially worried about, is how the tech giants and how all of us can participate in actual solutions to the militarization of these spaces. Because this is where it gets really scary. You know, compared to a tank, it's unbelievably cheap for a government to systematically manipulate information online. And ever since the end of the Cold War, governments have increasingly moved into this space because they know that they won't achieve their kind of political objectives using conventional military means anymore. And there, I think that is especially something where government and the tech giants need to work together in order to build more defences. Because I don't think we have even the slightest idea how much of our kind of online political debate is being manipulated and influenced at the moment by external interests. And that is a really terrifying place for us to be at exactly the moment when digital political debate has become one of the most, if not now, the most important venue for us to get information and learn about politics and eventually make decisions on things like voting.
That's, yeah, interesting. Simon, can I just come back? Facebook has, I think, been recruiting or employing fact checkers or fake news checkers on a growing scale. And is that since the American election?
Actually, it's not quite right. What we have been doing is working with fact-checking third parties, because one of the things we think everybody hopefully agrees with is Facebook should not be the arbiter of truth. There are lots of decisions we make about what's allowed and what's not allowed on our platform, but none of them are about what's true. And so what we do think, what we are experimenting with, is can we use third-party fact-checkers to help when lots of people are identifying a particular story as false? Can we ask a third-party fact-checker to review that, and then we can perhaps mark a story as disputed? You'll notice we haven't rolled this out everywhere. It's partly because we really don't see that actually this is as prevalent an issue in some markets as it is in others. So for us, this is something we're still kind of certainly working with Full Fact and First Draft on this, but we're not quite sure where it fits into the kind of range of things that we are doing on in the false news space. It certainly does not feel like it's a kind of an easy solution you can deploy.
Right. Yes.
Well, before I say what I'm going to say, I do want to say that I have a lot of respect for Simon, and it's great that Facebook are here, and I think it's much better that the tech giants come out and speak in debate than that they sort of hide behind. It's nothing to do with us, but there is a bit, Simon. But I'm trying to be balanced, But yeah, I think, and what we can all agree on, should all agree on, is that we need a regulatory framework, and it is up to government to put forward, to develop, and in part of a debate, a regulatory framework, and this government isn't doing it, and has absolutely, as far as I can see, no intention of doing that, and looking at issues around data ownership and fake news, etc., which are some of the most pressing of our day. But that said, what Facebook is saying, when you say you're not going to be the arbiter of truth, what you really mean is you're not going to take any responsibility for what's put out on your mega financially lucrative site. And but it does, because when you say you're not going to be the arbiter of truth, and that you're looking at third parties, some of whom are funded effectively by government. So your license fee or tax is going to support Facebook in what it is doing, rather than Facebook paying to check its own, because you're not the arbiter of truth, as you say, then you're not actually going to pay to verify what it is that's on your site. But let me just give a couple of other examples. So for example, of why this is such a wild west now, and why it needs to change. So as you know, Murdoch is looking to purchase the whole of Sky. Sky has, I think, 8 million customers, and it has their browsing history. It knows everything about them. It knows what they like to watch. It knows how long they like to watch for. It knows when they switch off watching. Right now, there's absolutely nothing, as I see it, as I understand it, to stop that data being used for political targeting by the same organisation that has the data. So you're not sharing it with somebody else, or the same organisation. There's nothing to stop them. There's something to stop them sharing it with us as a party, because that would be data sharing, but there's nothing to stop them using it for political targeting, and there's nothing to enable you to know that that is happening. And so whilst we have got the general data protection legislation coming through from the European Union, that still does not address some really important parts of this fake news debate about how it is used in sort of political warfare, if you like. Because I do agree with your point that we don't know the extent of politicizing of data collection and targeting, but we know it's going on, and we know that there's a lot of interest, both, if you like, in terms of espionage, but also just in terms of financial generation. I mean, there are some very interesting Western tech companies getting paid an awful lot during elections in Africa this year, and as to what they are being paid for, that is also not transparent. So when I say that I think we need a regulatory framework, and I think that regulatory framework has to give some access to algorithms, because it's not about publishing all your code. Though, I would be interested in your code, and the assumption that people can't understand code, or be interested in it is not, that only cyber criminals are interested and can understand code, is, I think, a bit, is a bit too far. But it should be accessible, I think, to those who have the interests that have legitimately the interests of the people at heart, and that is the democratic representatives.
How would you...
just quickly come back on that?
Yeah.
So I absolutely take your point, G, and I suppose I just wanted to convey that in trying to attack the purveyors of certain types of fake news, particularly clickbait, particularly the kind of information operations that Carl has mentioned, we're not doing it on the basis of judging whether it's true. What we're doing is noticing that there are certain patterns of fake news which are not about just putting fake news out there for the sake of it. They're there for a purpose, which is to take people off to clickbaity sites. That's a bad experience, let's address it. And let's use our technology to do that. So again, not because they're untrue, but because it's a bad experience. Similarly with fake accounts being used to spread this, let's attack the fake accounts, because you're not allowed to have a fake account on Facebook. So I suppose it's just about trying to indicate that we are not about to make a judgment on whether a story in The Guardian or the Mail or the BBC is true or not, even though quite often we will have colleagues of yours in the House of Commons who say to us, this isn't true in terms of a local paper report about them, you must take it down because it's fake news. And I hope you'd agree that would be wrong for us to take that decision.
I would agree. I would agree with that. Though, having said that, I do think you have some. I think we need a debate to determine the editorial responsibility that you have. And I know that in the US, because the US has very particular rules about whether companies like Facebook or media or not, and that has real implications. I think here we need to have a better debate about editorial responsibility. The other thing I would say is, my colleague Kat Smith has shared basically promises to rape female MPs, which are on Facebook, and which Facebook say do not break their community standards. And what
that's no longer true, though. We did act on it. So I'm sorry, just because it's something that when we were made aware of it, we acted on it. So I think there was an issue about how quickly we did it. So that stuff is absolutely off Facebook. It shouldn't have been there in the first place.
Okay. Well, you initially said that it didn't break your standards, because that's what you. And I think so. You are taking action, but you're doing it on your terms and at your speed. And what I'm saying is, it needs to be done on the people's terms and at the people's speed.
Can you say a little bit more about just what would the objective of legislation be? Because one reason the government hasn't done something, maybe because it's just too hard to define.
Well, that isn't why they didn't get into Brexit, though.
That was a whole other issue. That's one hard thing to be grappling with.
No, I think to be serious, I don't think government should step aside for things because they're hard, but I think you're absolutely right. It's hard, and it's it's forward looking, and who wants to be crystal ball gazing? But just to give you the example of what the last Labour government did not long after it came in, which was to look 10 years ahead at what was then this wild thing called the internet and convergence, and look to develop a forward-looking regulatory framework. That was how Ofcom was born, and that was Lord Putnam and lots of experts. It was about, I forget how long, it was 18 months of debate and discussion and quite a few late nights in Parliament, and came out with a regulatory framework for convergence and communications in the future, which actually lasted 10 years quite well. But we have had no work like that. So I'm not going to say exactly what a legislative framework to address data, big data, AI and fake news and some of the other challenges that the digital age is throwing up. But I am saying that we should be debating it. We should be setting out that government has a responsibility here, and we should be drawing people together to say, this is how it should look. And for one example, might be that you have a right of challenge to understand what the algorithm which is feeding me, rape threats, what that algorithm looks like, and some regulator could look at it and say what it looks like and why is it doing that, for example.
Okay, Simon, would you welcome a bit of clearer legislation?
I think it's a really difficult area, and I absolutely understand. We understand why politicians in several countries are kind of considering this and trying to figure out what the right way through is. In our view, and indeed almost from the beginning of Facebook, we've never thought we must wait until politicians regulate before we decide how we think the community the size of Facebook should operate and what should be allowed and what's not allowed. And that's why we've got our own set of rules on this. We also invest enormous amounts of money mainly in terms of people. So we just recently announced we're going to add 3,500 people to our team of 4,000 in community operations who review reports as well and help to keep people safe. So so we're not waiting, but we are absolutely want to participate in this and try and really understand what is the problem that you want to try and address through regulation, and are we already addressing it through other means, and if not, can we, so that you don't have to try and come up with a way of regulating that looks really hard, as everyone in this room would attest when it comes to trying to regulate the internet. Let's not wait for that. And so we're not waiting, but we're absolutely engaging.
Please, yeah.
I mean,
Carl.
that's what I think is absolutely what we need. I mean, every time I hear government say that tech giants need to take more responsibility, I think government is not taking responsibility. I mean, look, I mean, there is no regulation at all in the UK for political debate or political campaigning online. None at all. It's a total Wild West. There is absolutely no guidance on this whatsoever. So what is really happening at the moment is almost like a kind of trial by media. Like Facebook responds if there's a particularly prominent person who can kind of reputationally damage Facebook in a particular way, and then they take stuff down, or then they react. And they react in regimes which are important markets for Facebook, naturally enough, and they react in regimes where they've got lots of people and they've got buildings and hardware and other things that the law can coerce, naturally enough. Now, the basic problem, and I think this is an underlying primal and profound kind of question of our age, really, is there's a kind of race between politics and technology. Like, these two things are often heading in completely different directions. And unless politics asserts itself over the online world, and yesterday I was in a House of Lords committee, and I heard legislators say time and again, we can't do anything in this area. That's a terrifying thing to hear. Unless politicians assert themselves over this, unless we do get a really clear message from government saying this is a regulatory framework, you will apply this because we are the sovereign state here, we're always going to see this kind of cut and paste, kind of utterly patchy kind of provision. And it's just simply not good enough. And it isn't just good enough for politicians to kind of call on tech giants, I think, to do more. I think government has to kind of just really clearly and systematically tell them what they want to be done.
Yeah. James, do you...
I'm going to do something unexpected here and spring to Facebook's defence. And I think there's a real danger that we go too far with government involvement in this issue. And I think the calls to see parts of Facebook's algorithm, I find as someone in tech, I find that terrifying that the government would want to see inside the thing that makes Facebook tick. I'll give you an example on that. Microsoft had to build centres in China so that they could show the Chinese government the code that powers their software. It's also believed that Apple had to do the same thing to start selling the iPhone there as well. And I think there's a real danger that we introduce an anti-competitive environment by intruding too far into tech companies.
We've done that. We've done that here.
And that is concerning that we do that. And I think if that became more prevalent, I would be worried about the impact.
So if you're sacked from your job, which I'm sure is a very good one, if you're sacked from your job by an algorithm, I actually think that right now you would have a right under industrial tribunal to have you'd have a kind of natural justice right to see that algorithm. But I don't know, because it's not clarified.
Well, to confront the algorithm.
To understand, to know why you were sacked, and that might mean going into the algorithm. Because, for example, in New York State, they are paying teachers based on performance, which is being calculated by an algorithm.
Bail, no bail?
Yes.
Bail decisions being made in the States as well, algorithmically?
Yeah, algorithmically, and I think people have a right to know what that algorithm...
I think there's
So what you're saying is that whatever power algorithms have, and they may have a lot of power over people's lives, jobs, schools, whatever power algorithms have, people should have no rights of,
No,
transparency.
that's not what I'm saying. I think a government demanding access to the underlying code that powers these companies is scary, and I'd be worried about that kind of intrusion. I think people have a right to know, for example, as Simon mentioned, tweaks to the newsfeed, changes on how it displays stories, but demanding access to the source code of an internet company, we could end up with something, you might remember Google News in Spain. The Spanish government passed a law that basically said every time there was, I believe, a hyperlink to a certain news story, you had to pay the publisher. And what Google did in Spain was disable Google News. So they don't have that there. And that introduces that environment where tech companies, if there are these demands, an increasing amount of government intrusion, they say, you know what, we don't have to operate here.
Yeah.
Totally
Simon, you wanted to make a...
Yeah, I just want to give an example of how we do help people when it comes to transparency. And the classic one is advertising, where people will often ask me, well, why am I seeing this ad? And actually, and this is not just on Facebook, lots of the big advertising platforms will have this now. We have ad preferences, so you can go in and see exactly why you have seen this ad. And if there's something in your preferences that you don't want to be included, as in you don't want that piece of information that you've shared on Facebook or elsewhere to be used to serve you ads, you take it out. And you can also control it to say, I never want to see ads again from Spokes trousers because I've got too many pairs of them, or whatever. So we give people kind of information and control. But one of the things that's really hard, and I think this is something where it'd be great to get your perspective on this as well as others in the room, is there's only so much you can do in terms of explaining to people how is this working before it becomes such a turn-off that they turn away from that platform, or they just ignore it and treat it, as we always have this issue around terms and conditions. How many of us actually read those terms and conditions? We just want to get to the agree button so we can get on with it. And so getting that balance right, and we're always trying new ways of doing this, getting that balance right between how do you help people understand how this works so that they can make informed choices about how they want it to work for them. Because after all, the newsfeed you see is unique for every single one of the 2 billion plus people using Facebook. That's one where we absolutely see the value of partnerships around media literacy. We work a lot with our colleagues in advertising to try and improve young people's understanding of how ads works. Because if we can focus on the kind of young generation, hopefully that will carry on. So there's all different ways we can do this to improve the transparency of our platforms without us, and thanks James for your kind words, without a suggestion that, as it were, we're public utilities where everything has to be opened up for people to see. And there's a balance here, as always.
I'm afraid that now I have to go back to Parliament too, because we're voting on public sector pay. But just let me say to you, I mean, when I am, and I'm voting to end the cap, but when I worked at Ofcom, we were trying to be a really light touch regulator, and we made a big thing about informed consent for consumers. You didn't need regulation as long as you had informed consent. The point is, when you have a 75-page terms and conditions, when we live in an information age, I think the concept of informed consent begins to imply that human beings don't have better things to do with their lives, and that is why people fought to develop democratic government, so that they didn't need to be spending, one of the reasons, they didn't need to be spending all the time, every day, looking at all the terms and conditions associated with every potential traction.
And researchers.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. And I just think that, I'm going to go now, but the message to leave you with is that we are tech, people have always been afraid of tech, but now people are finding tech intrusive in a way that, some people find government intrusive. And I think there's a really big danger that tech is going to be the next financial services sort of industry, where people say they want their children to go work in tech because of the bad reputation it has in people's lives of not listening, not being open, not being transparent, and not empowering people in a real meaningful way. So that's not a very positive note to leave. I just say I'm a tech evangelist. I think tech's wonderful.
Thanks, I'm going to open up to the floor in a second. I've got one more question as Chi's leaving that I wanted to put to you. Is tech, getting back to fake news, is there a technological answer or solution in using algorithms to authenticate real news and by definition therefore label the unauthentic news? Can that be done, or is it just too simplistic?
Is that for?
Simon or...
I mean, one of the things we certainly can do is ensure that brands from news organisations are very prominent, and we recently made some changes in how Facebook works to that effect, because one of the issues that publishers have said to us is people don't know, they think it's reported that people are getting news from Facebook, when in fact they may be getting news from the Daily Mail on Facebook, and we want the Daily Mail to get that attribution. So there are definitely things one can do to help, but of course we then have to be careful of, well, are we just going to focus on the brands that everybody knows, when actually there are lots of really interesting new brands in the news space, and let's make sure we don't just favour those brands that people of my generation like. Let's also be thinking about who are the new providers of news and how can we help them use a platform like Facebook.
James, did you?
My vote's going to be later, so I'll wait for the first round.
Okay, brilliant. Okay.
I think the short answer is there an algorithmic solution to verifying news? Is no, otherwise I think a very wealthy startup would have done that already. I think the long answer is I think we all play a part in that, whether that's the people who create it, whether that's people moderating it, people on Facebook, and not just Facebook, but other tech companies themselves. I mean, we all have a part to play in that.
Good. Okay.
Just a very brief thought on algorithmic transparency. I think it is utterly inevitable sooner or later that these algorithms will be made transparent. I think it just simply isn't sustainable that they're not. This is one of the, I mentioned this at the beginning, like the problem here is that these tech giants are both legitimately profit-seeking entities and also the guardians now of a new massively important public life. They're both at the same time. Yeah. So they're both properly, these algorithms are proprietary property of those companies. Facebook paid to develop it. It's legitimate that it wants to protect its investment. But then also the news algorithm of Facebook is more powerful than any editor on the planet. I mean, it clearly is. And we are going to, I think, have to come up with some new structure, neither public nor just profit-seeking, some kind of new thing that we can put these algorithms into. We've always fought to civilise power. We've always fought to make it accountable, to make it transparent, to give rights of restitution. That's why we live in a liberal democratic country, exactly because we have civilised power. And these algorithms are new centres of power, they're new loci of power, and yet we haven't yet managed to civilise them in that way. We haven't made them transparent, accountable, we haven't given ourselves rights of restitution. I just think it's so obvious that is going to happen sooner or later.
That's an excellent summary, thank you very much. Right, questions from the floor? Let me kick off. Sorry, I'm going to start with there's a lady here.
Hi, Maria Farrell. To Chief's question, there is something in the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which is going to give individuals a right to question algorithmic decision-making that suits them. It's very vague, it's very new, but I think it's the beginning. More broadly, fake news is not some unfortunate consequence of the social media giants. It is the system working as it should, right? It's the attention economy. The whole point is to maximize people's attention by manipulating their emotions. That's how it works. So this isn't some unfortunate consequence, it's basically doing its job. The more upset people are, the more appalled they are, the more angry they are by content that they see, the more they keep clicking, the more they keep looking at ads, and the more they keep generating data streams that allow the model to work. So this isn't, it's not a bug of the system. It's not even a feature of the system. This is fundamentally what the system of social media giants is designed to do.
Thank you. Down here. Questions?
Thank you. Khaled Fatal, MLI Group. I was listening to the debates and I couldn't help myself asking the question, are we all talking about the same thing? Yes, it is fake news. But I would venture that if we ask each individual to define it, we'd probably get different definitions. So I'm going to throw this curveball, as I've done in earlier interventions, and put this challenge to everybody and see at least if we can agree on this, that it might make the role of individuals, social media networks, and others, and even governments, realize what their role towards fake news is. Would we all agree that fake news is a threat to our democracy?
Okay.
Now, if we, there's a fundamental point behind that. Mm-hmm. Second question here is, although it may have sounded as if it was like Facebook bashing platform, and I think Simon did an excellent job explaining what Facebook is doing on the space. But it would be clearer to recognize if Facebook identifies itself as purely a technical platform or whether they are a publisher And we've heard this conversation before. Fundamentally, if we recognize that fake news is a threat to our democracy, we recognize how it impacted on the US elections. It had an impact, allegedly, against the Brexit vote, etc., etc., the French elections. From that point, then the role of all members of society, including governments, they have to step up. We have to step up to the plate, and it can be deferred to others.
Thank you. Let me put that question. Threat to democracy?
Well, I think one of the things I started off by saying was that I didn't want to get into a debate about a definition of fake news. I wanted to rather define it by the negative impacts that it had. So where it is a threat to democracy, then it is fake news, if you like, in a definite way. And of course, it can be if democracy is dependent on transparency and information and understanding, which it is, then it can be. And where it can be manipulated by outside and potentially criminals and foreign organisations, then clearly it can be.
Yeah. Okay. Can I pass it on to you, Carl?
I mean, yeah, I think we began, my first point was that fake news is a bad concept to understand very different phenomena. I think that's one that's worth reiterating. I think we are talking about lots of different things here. Simon mentioned, I presented two. Simon, it'd be useful to know the other types, species of fake news that Facebook see to exist. Yes, I mean, I think that kind of democracy always relies on an informed citizenry. So in that sense, misinformation's always been a threat to it. The particular sharp end of this, the one that I keep going back to and that I think is especially pernicious, is kind of organised, concerted attempts to try and change the information landscape. That's the one I think we know least about, and that is the one that I think, when deployed, actually is the most pernicious. So I think that's the most worrying threat that I think we're now actually trying to deal with. James?
Is fake news a threat to democracy? I think it's part of it, which echoes the lady's point from earlier. You know, satire, parody, clickbait. I think that's part of what we have to accept. What we do need to distinguish is, as Carl mentioned just now, sort of criminal, politicized fake news, where there's a clear aim, where it is very specifically a threat to democracy. I think the whole thing is part of what we have to deal with now. I think we need to drill down into what is genuinely dangerous within that.
Yeah.
I really think we need to look to researchers like Carl and others to help us really understand the nature of democracy in the internet age, and whether the extent to which some of the things we saw as a threat to democracy pre-internet, how much they've carried over, how much they've been reinforced, including false news. But it's certainly, I wouldn't think of it alone. One of the interesting issues for us when we were being asked about this during the UK election was, well, what are the rules about campaigning, what you can and can't say about your opponent? And in fact, there are no rules. And there's no way, apart from, in fact, the only rule is the police. So the Electoral Commission has no role at all in deciding whether or not electoral communications are true or false. The only people who can exert any authority here are the police, and they do it incredibly rarely. Incredibly rarely. So this notion that, given that the way that the UK Parliament, and other systems are different, but the UK Parliament has decided not to require that of campaigns to actually tell the truth, makes it really hard to figure out, well, if you want to say that false news is a threat to democracy, do you have to introduce a rule that says you cannot lie about your opponent during an election campaign, including, for instance, can you say things...
It's not entirely true. It's not entirely true. And in communications that as a politician I put out during my election campaign, and they always have to have who is putting them out and promoting them so that they can be traced. And there is I forget the exact wording, but there is a requirement, certainly in written electoral communications, that it does not slander or something.
But it's not the Electoral Commission that enforces it.
It's not the Electoral Commission
that enforces it. It's the police that have to do it.
Simon,
so I just think that, to me, this is a much broader issue than false news, social media and elections.
Okay, but
it's about the whole nature of democracy in the internet
Let me
age.
put one follow-up question there.
Sure.
Going back to the Financial Times analysis this week, they said the Russians effectively stole the election in America by hacking and by spreading false news via Facebook. Is that and that swung the election enough to And that's you know, that was a clear,
there's
clear
no way
blame on
that
Facebook.
can be evidence.
Well, I just want to put it to Simon, is that something which is that kind of analysis caused sufficient alarm in Facebook? Because my impression is that it has.
It's a classic case, isn't it, when Facebook last week put out far more information than any other tech company about things that we saw during the election, having previously published a whole report on information operations by Russian and other governments. We then dug deeper and we found these 470 accounts that had spent about $100,000, which, although it's quite a lot of money, is not a lot of money when it comes to election and campaign spending in the US over 18 months. And that they were associated with a particular troll farm in Russia. You can imagine the amount of digging that our specialist teams had to do in order to identify that. We put that out there in the public domain. We, of course, let the authorities in the US know, who are reviewing the whole nature of Russian interference in the US election. And that becomes, well, somehow this is proof. It surely isn't. But it's certainly new information that we know the authorities there were grateful to receive. And we all wait to see what the conclusions of those investigations are into the extent of Russian interference in the US election. But our report was not saying, ergo, you know, a certain number of people voted one way or another. It's just that we found this stuff that should not have been going on, and we've addressed it, and now we're being transparent about it.
The law is also a total mess. Sorry, just an incredibly quick point. There's about half a dozen pieces of legislation which can be applied to on online communications. Malicious Communications Act, Communications Act, Public Order legislation, harassment legislation, all of which was drafted before the social media age. The fact that this isn't receiving legislative attention is absolutely bonkers, because the police, the Crown Prosecution Service, it's entirely confusing to everybody exactly what you can and can't say online.
Okay. Yeah. Do we have to wrap up?
Yeah, I think I'm afraid so. We've already gone over time. It's been a very
thank you.
Very enlivening and fascinating debate. Before we give our panel speakers a fantastic round of applause, I just wanted to have a quick poll of the audience as to who's enjoyed the panel discussion this afternoon. and secondly,
who hasn't?
As a result of this, is not fake news. As a result of the panel discussion, who feels we've got closer to solving the problem of fake news? All right. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Thanks, panel.